fiscal discipline to Ottawa, and yes, we're going to have to stop running deficits. It has a direct impact on the value of our dollar, and that has a direct impact on affordability.
You know, when my colleagues talk about households, I talk about families. When they talk about, you know, the macro picture, I talk about what it means for individuals.
I have the experience, the plan, and the guts to stand up to Trump. We need a leader who understands the seriousness of the challenge and is ready to meet it.
So our economy was weak before we got to the point of these threats from President Trump. That's why we need big changes. That's the reason I'm here.
Debates are done, and Liberal Party members can cast advance ballots as of today for their next leader, who will replace Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister. Frank Baylis, Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland, and Karina Gould faced off last night in Montreal on Canada-U.S. relations, climate, and the economy, each trying to make a case for why they'd handle the files best, while largely agreeing on the majority of issues, save perhaps for Gould, who launched some soft jabs at her opponents. And Karina Gould is here. Hi, Ms. Gould. Good to have you back here in studio. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Dashi.
I have a number of questions about things that you said in the debate last night, but I want to start off on what the Conservatives are still talking about today, which is Mark Carney and Brookfield. Do you think anything is shady about the way in which he handled that?
I think that's up to Mr. Carney to talk about. I don't know enough about it to have a comment, but what I can say is that I think it's important that we keep Canadian jobs here in Canada.
Why is it, and I take your point, obviously we tried to get him on tonight as well as you, and he declined our request, but you weren't afraid last night to take some shots at, for example, him bringing a calculator to a knife fight or being conservative light in some of the policies that he's putting forward. This is a pretty serious accusation that essentially he, you know, didn't tell the truth last night. Does that bother you as someone who, if he does win, will ultimately be in the same party?
Again, I actually don't know much about this, so I think those are really good questions to put to Mr. Carney. I mean, I think he has to have a very clear answer for Canadians on that, but I'm not here to defend him. That's his job.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on the conservative light criticism that you levied last night. I think what you said more specifically was when you were asked to follow up on calling some of your colleagues conservative light, and you talked about being proud to be a liberal. I'm not going to compromise my values, compromise my convictions, because I think that's what the polling wants. What's so bad about wanting to balance the budget?
I don't think there's anything wrong about balancing the budget. I just think that we have to be honest with Canadians about what that means. And that means cuts. And so if that's what Canadians want, we have to be honest with them. Look, you know, he talked about balancing the budget in 3 years. And the way that he wants to do that is by growing the economy. I'm all for growing the economy. I'm all for increasing productivity. But to do that to such a degree in 3 years that it'll balance the budget, I just don't think that's realistic. So my position is let's work towards balance. Let's make sure that we are responsible fiscal managers. But I'm also not going to tell Canadians that I'm going to do something that I know is not possible.
But when you say you're going to work toward, for example, balancing the budget, I mean, your government has said things like that as the budget, as the budgetary deficit, pardon me, grew by quite significant numbers. So are you actually planning to balance the budget, or are you just going to keep spending at levels that we see right now?
I'm going to do what we need to do for the time. So one of the reasons why the deficit grew is because we did massive spending during the pandemic to keep Canadians solvent and to make sure they had jobs to come back to when the health measures were lifted. We might be facing a very extreme hit to our economy when it comes to these potential tariffs from Donald Trump. I don't think it's the time to say to Canadians, I'm going to balance the budget, when we might need to have some pretty big programs to keep Canadians who might lose their jobs because of these tariffs, you know, able to pay some of their bills at the end of the month, and to keep our companies here in Canada. So I'm not going to make promises that I can't keep. I'm just going to be open and transparent with Canadians, which is why I'm not saying right now, this is what I'm going to do, because Canadians might be facing a massive hit to our economy, and I believe it's the federal government's job to be there for Canadians.
What if they're not, though? Let's say, let's take that out of the equation for a second. I think what your colleagues who are talking about moving more to the center are referencing, for example, even specifically last night, is the economic record in particular outside of the pandemic, where we saw the public service grow by more than 6% between 2022 and 2023 after the pandemic, where even in the last year, outsourcing grew by more than 13% after your government promised to decrease it. Yeah. Is that not like that's not just about the pandemic. It's not just about responding to Donald Trump. It seems like things are a bit out of control. Like, can you not acknowledge that?
Yeah, I can. And I mean, when I saw the numbers for outsourcing, I was also blown away because, I mean, at the end of the day, like, we need public servants to be delivering services for Canadians and not to be outsourcing everything. That's a problem in the public service that we as Canadians have to tackle because it's just not acceptable. And I think it's also about making choices about where we're spending our money. One of the things that I will acknowledge is that I think particularly over the past couple of years, we didn't make hard choices. We just kind of said we're going to do it all. And that's not necessarily what we can do. So for me, it's about saying, okay, here's the plan that I have. We might not do everything in year one. Maybe that's over 4 years. And we also have to balance those decisions with where the economy is and what the threats that we're facing to our economy is.
But what hard choices are you telling Canadians that you're prepared to make? And with great respect, like the idea that this is a problem and just happened, like you sat at the nexus of government while it did.
Yeah, but I'm here now because I want to fix those things. I mean, the reason why
But you're
I'm
part
running,
of a government that created the problem.
Yeah, but I'm also was there and saw things that I didn't necessarily agree with. And so now I have the opportunity in this leadership campaign to put forward my own ideas, to put forward my own vision, but doing it grounded in liberal values. And that's something that's really important to me. You know, liberals win elections when we run as liberals. And that is something that I hear from liberals across this country is that there are things that we did as a government that people are really proud of. The Canada Child Benefit, early learning and child care, our work that we did to reduce emissions. Those are all things that liberals are proud of. I'm not going to run away from that record, but there are also things that we did that we didn't do very well. You know, when inflation was getting out of control, we didn't hear Canadians when they were telling us that they were having trouble making ends meet, and we were focused on other things. So, you know, my commitment to Canadians is to say, like, I'm a grassroots politician, I listen to people, and I'm going to make sure that the government responds to what your needs are.
You also just said, though, that you would make hard choices if you were Prime Minister. Like, what is an example of a hard choice that you would make and not just spend everywhere all the time?
Well, it's deciding on what are the priorities. You know, again, we did a lot of different programs all at once, which are having a positive impact on people, but also means that we're spending money. You know, I can't tell you in this exact moment what hard choice I would make right now as Prime Minister because I need to be sitting in that seat and seeing what the current moment looks like. But for me, I can tell you what my priorities are. My priorities is tackling the housing crisis because that is something that is #1 for Canadians. It's modernizing our social safety net. We have a social safety net that doesn't work for Canadians. Poverty costs us money and we need to support Canadians to catch them when they fall, but to lift them back up. And I want to create an environment, an economy where people have an opportunity to create a business, grow a business, and keep that business here in Canada. I want to create 1 million new entrepreneurs over the coming years so that we have this opportunity for economic growth. So for me, those are my priorities as Prime Minister to really deal with the issues that are facing Canadians right now.
But all of what you just laid out requires a lot more spending, yet you say you're going to make tough decisions. So does that mean that you plan to spend less than the government you've been a part of for the last number of years?
Yes, it does in certain areas, but creating a strong business environment will also create economic growth. Investing in building new houses also creates economic growth because it means that you've got developers building, you've got employees building, you've got an industry there. What we need to do is both tackle social issues while growing our economy. So
isn't that the argument Mr. Carney and Ms. Freeland and Mr. Bayless are making, though, that you call conservative light, basically that we hope to grow the economy in order to balance out spending on key priorities?
Yeah, but I'm not planning on doing that in 3 years. I'm being realistic with Canadians. I mean, we do need to grow our economy. That's exactly what we need to do, but I'm not going to give people an unrealistic objective. And I also think we need to have one budget. I mean, I don't think it makes sense for us to be separating out budgets. We have to be honest and transparent with Canadians. We saw that they tried to do that in Alberta. It didn't work. They're trying to do it in the UK. They're having trouble meeting that objective right now. So for me, it's about being honest with Canadians about what our fiscal situation looks like and what we intend to do.
I wanted to ask one last thing about an issue that came up last night and has come up on multiple occasions, the carbon tax. You're the only candidate not promising essentially to get rid of it, and you're going to keep it where it is. goals that your government set out, though, for 2030, which I imagine you will continue to subscribe to, entail that carbon price rising, that consumer carbon price rising, in order to meet the amount of emissions that it's going to decrease. So it's going to be 10% essentially by 2030 of how emissions decrease. How does pausing it not let the world burn, as you described last night, for your kids?
Well, because I think we have to pause it, because when Canadians are talking about the carbon tax, what they're really talking about is affordability, which is why I've put forward other ideas on affordability, like tackling the housing crisis, like reducing the GST from 5 to 4%, like reforming and modernizing our social safety net to tackle the issues that Canadians care about. But getting rid of the price on pollution won't enable us to meet our emissions reductions target. And what I said last night, and where I pushed some of my colleagues, is that okay, so you're going to remove the price on pollution. You don't have a plan to make up those emissions reductions. If you put all of that on the industrial price, that's neither going to make up for it, or if you do, that is going to put such a big price on our industries that it's going to be pushed back to consumers anyways. And if you don't have a plan for the checks, you don't have a plan for affordability either. And the middle class tax cut that both Mr. Carney and Ms. Freeland are proposing, the math doesn't add up, and it doesn't help all Canadians. It doesn't help low and no income Canadians. So what I'm saying is that I hear Canadians when they say now is not the time to increase it. I'm going to cancel that increase, but we need to have a conversation about what our emissions reductions look like in this country, and that's something that I'm willing to have.
Is it canceling, or is it just postponing the increase? Because again, without the increase, you will not meet the objectives as your government has designed them by 2030. And while you say the others aren't talking about how exactly or being accurate and how they might make it up, either are you.
I'm going to cancel it, but I also know that there are other things we can do to reduce our emissions. So that's why I'm going to increase our rebate for electric vehicles and hybrids, but include gas hybrids in that as well. I was telling you that I was in Alberta and Saskatchewan. That might be one way to get rural Canadians to buy hybrid vehicles if you include gas hybrids in there.
And you know that's going to make it up for all the increases planned over the next 6 years?
Any reduction in our emissions is a good thing. I'm also going to bring back and increase the home energy retrofit program. Again, I was in Alberta and Saskatchewan. It was like minus 30 when I was there. Heating your home is an imperative, but let's make it easier for Canadians to heat their home in a way that is going to reduce their emissions and save them money on their energy bills. So we can do this as a country.
But how do you know? Like, do you have scientific evidence that what you've spelled out is actually going to make up the difference, is actually going to get you to the goals that you've achieved? Because you accuse your opponents of essentially being okay with letting the country burn.
Look, I am going to have a plan that is going to get those emissions reduced, but that has to be a diverse plan. It has to include a multitude of different things, including the consumer price, but frozen at the current levels. That's something that's still going to help us meet those emissions reductions targets. It's going to include an industrial price, but it's not going to be supersized, so it's going to impact our industry to the point where they suffer. And it's going to include opportunities for individuals to make the choices that they want to make to reduce their emissions and to save money.
Okay, I'm out of time. I've got to leave it there. Thanks for your time as always, Ms. Gould.
Thanks for having me, Vashti.